I watched in horror as thousands of gallons of chlorinated water crashed through Sheriff Karen's front door like a tidal wave. Her screams echoed from inside as her pristine white furniture floated past the windows. 3 months ago, I never imagined I would become the kind of person who floods a neighbor's house in the middle of the night. But when someone destroys everything you love and hides behind a badge, sometimes justice requires getting your hands dirty. And that night, Karen finally learned what it felt like to drown. My name is David, and for 15 years I lived the quiet suburban dream on Maple Street. Every morning I would step onto my back deck with a steaming cup of coffee and survey my little kingdom. The flower beds were perfectly manicured. The grass was emerald green and thick as carpet. My vegetable garden produced tomatoes so perfect that neighbors would stop by just to admire them. I took pride in my property. After working construction for 20 years, my hands knew the satisfaction of building something beautiful from nothing. Every weekend found me outside, trimming hedges, planting seasonal flowers, or adding another improvement to my outdoor paradise. My wife Sarah used to joke that I loved that yard more than I loved her. She was not entirely wrong. The house next door had been empty for months when Sheriff Karen moved in. I remember the day clearly because I was replanting my rose bushes when the moving truck arrived. She seemed professional, maybe a little stern, but that came with the job. When she introduced herself, she made sure to mention her title twice in the first minute. "I am Sheriff Karen Martinez," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I work for the county sheriff's department. I keep this community safe." I smiled and welcomed her to the neighborhood. "I am David. I work in construction, but I spend most of my free time out here in the yard. If you ever need anything, just holler." She nodded approvingly as she looked around my property. "You keep a nice place. I appreciate neighbors who take care of their homes. It reflects well on the whole street." Those first few weeks, Karen seemed like the ideal neighbor. She kept her property clean, parked her patrol car neatly in the driveway, and always waved when she saw me working outside. Sometimes she would stop at the fence line and ask about my gardening techniques or compliment a particularly impressive bloom. But even then, I noticed something unsettling about her tone. When she spoke, it sounded less like friendly conversation and more like she was conducting an interview. Her questions felt like interrogation. Her compliments came with subtle suggestions about how I could do things better. "Those tomatoes look good," she said one evening, "but you might want to stake them higher. The county has regulations about vegetation that might obstruct sight lines." I had never heard of such a regulation, but I thanked her for the advice and said I would look into it. She smiled and nodded like she had just done me a tremendous favor. That smile should have been my first warning. The peaceful morning routine ended abruptly on a Tuesday in May when heavy machinery rumbled down our quiet street. I looked out my kitchen window to see a massive truck backing into Karen's driveway, followed by workers carrying shovels and surveying equipment. Karen appeared on her front porch wearing her uniform, clipboard in hand, directing the operation like a military commander. When she saw me watching through my window, she waved and walked over to the fence separating our properties. "Big day today," she announced. "Getting my pool installed. Above ground, 24 feet across. Going to be perfect for entertaining and relaxation after long shifts keeping the community safe." I set down my coffee mug and joined her at the fence. The work crew was already measuring distances and spray painting marks on her lawn. What concerned me immediately was how close to our shared property line they were working. "Looks like a nice size pool," I said carefully. "Where exactly are you planning to put it?" Karen pointed to a spot that was less than 10 feet from my prize-winning flower garden. Right there. Perfect location. Get sun all day, and I will have a great view of the whole neighborhood from up there. My stomach dropped. Karen, I am just wondering about drainage. With a pool that size, you are going to have overflow issues when it rains, and that water has to go somewhere. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming cooler and more formal. I had professionals survey the land. Everything is up to code. The county approved all my permits. I am sure it is, I said quickly, trying to keep things friendly. I just want to make sure we are both thinking about how to protect our properties. My flower beds took years to establish, and they are pretty sensitive to too much water. Karen's smile disappeared completely. David, I appreciate your concern, but I know what I am doing. I am a law enforcement officer. I do not make decisions without considering all the angles. The way she emphasized her title made it clear that this conversation was over. I nodded and retreated to my house, but I spent the rest of the day watching the installation with growing unease. The pool was massive. When fully assembled, it towered above our fence line like a giant blue barrel. From my bedroom window, I could see directly into it, and I realized that Karen could now see directly into my backyard from her elevated pool deck. The workers finished late that evening, leaving behind a mountain of excavated dirt and construction debris scattered across both properties. When I went outside to assess the damage, I found muddy footprints all through my flower beds and deep tire ruts in my lawn. I knocked on Karen's door to discuss the cleanup, but she was not home. Her patrol car was gone, and the house was dark. I decided to wait until morning to address the issue, hoping she would be reasonable about fixing the damage her crew had caused. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sound of water filling the pool. The pump ran for hours, a constant mechanical humming that replaced the peaceful quiet I had enjoyed for 15 years. Sarah rolled over and pressed a pillow against her ear. "This is going to be a problem," she whispered. I stared at the ceiling and wondered if it was too late to build a taller fence. The first disaster happened on a Sunday morning in June. I was enjoying my coffee on the deck when I heard the sound of rushing water. At first, I thought a pipe had burst somewhere, but when I walked around to investigate, I discovered the source. Karen's pool was overflowing in a spectacular cascade that poured directly into my flower garden. Hundreds of gallons of chlorinated water were drowning my prized roses, washing away months of careful mulching, and turning my carefully maintained soil into a muddy swamp. I ran to Karen's back door and knocked urgently. She appeared wearing a bathrobe, looking annoyed at being disturbed. "Karen, your pool is overflowing into my yard," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "The water is destroying my flower beds." She walked over to look at the situation with the casual interest of someone observing the weather. "Oh, that. Yeah, I overfilled it last night. Sometimes the automatic system runs a little long." I stared at her in disbelief. "Sometimes. Karen, this is serious damage. Those roses took 3 years to establish. The soil chemistry is completely ruined now." She shrugged. "It is just water, David. Plants need water to grow." "Not chlorinated pool water," I said, feeling my frustration rising. "This stuff kills plants, and the volume is washing away all my topsoil." Karen's expression hardened. "Look, I am sorry if you are upset, but this is not my problem. Water flows downhill. That is just geography." "But you created the problem by overfilling your pool," I protested. "You have a responsibility to control your runoff." "Do I?" she asked, crossing her arms. Because as far as I know, what happens on my property is my business, and what happens on your property is your business. I felt the conversation slipping away from me. Karen, I am just asking you to be more careful about the water level. Maybe install some better drainage, or just do not fill it so high. David, she said, her voice taking on an official tone, I am going to give you some free advice. You do not want to make an enemy of the person who keeps this neighborhood safe. I have been nothing but friendly to you, but if you start causing problems over every little thing, we are going to have issues. The threat was unmistakable, even delivered with a smile. I realized I was not talking to my neighbor anymore. I was talking to Sheriff Karen, and she was making it clear that challenging her would have consequences. I am not trying to cause problems, I said carefully. I am just trying to protect my property. Then we understand each other, she replied, turning to go back inside. Accidents happen, deal with it. The door closed with a firm click, leaving me standing in the morning sun surrounded by the wreckage of my flower garden. The water was still flowing, carrying away soil and drowning the plants I had nurtured for years. I spent the rest of the day trying to salvage what I could. I built temporary barriers with sandbags, redirected the worst of the flow, and transplanted the roses that were not already dead. By evening, my back ached and my hands were raw from digging in the mud. Sarah found me sitting on the deck, staring at the destruction. How bad is it? She asked. 3 years of work, I said quietly, gone in one morning. What did Karen say when you talked to her? I looked up at the massive pool looming over our fence. She said it was not her problem. Sarah sat down beside me and took my muddy hand in hers. David, maybe we should call someone, the city or the county. There have to be regulations about this kind of thing. I nodded, but even as I agreed, I remembered the way Karen had smiled when she threatened me. She was not just my neighbor anymore. She was Sheriff Karen, and she had made it very clear that crossing her would be dangerous. That night, I researched drainage laws and property rights on my computer until my eyes burned. But every resource I found led back to the same conclusion. I would need to file a complaint with the county sheriff's department. Karen's department. Over the next month, Karen's pool became a weapon of deliberate harassment. Every few days, I would wake up to find my yard flooded again. Sometimes it was overflow from her pool parties that ran late into the night. Sometimes it was mysterious equipment malfunctions that happened to occur when I was not home to document them. Each incident destroyed more of my landscaping. The grass in my backyard turned yellow and died from the constant saturation of chlorinated water. My vegetable garden became a wasteland of rotting plants and contaminated soil. The wooden deck I had built with my own hands began to warp and buckle from the constant moisture. I tried calling the county offices to file a complaint, only to be transferred from department to department, until someone finally told me that property disputes needed to be handled by the sheriff's office. When I asked to speak to Karen's supervisor, I was told that Sheriff Karen was the supervisor for our district. Maybe you could speak to her directly, the dispatcher suggested. Work it out neighbor to neighbor. I almost laughed at the absurdity. I have tried that approach. She told me it was not her problem. Well, sir, without evidence of intentional damage, there is not much we can do. Property line disputes are usually civil matters. I hung up the phone feeling more frustrated than ever. Karen had created a perfect system. She was causing the damage, investigating the complaints, and dismissing them all at the same time. But the worst part was discovering that I was not her only victim. During one of my sleepless nights spent researching legal options, I found myself talking to my neighbor across the street, Mrs. Rodriguez. "That woman is a menace," she whispered, glancing around nervously as if Karen might be listening. "She got my son arrested last month for having an expired registration sticker, kept him in jail overnight for a piece of paper that was 2 days old." "That seems excessive," I said. "It gets worse. She impounded his car and charged him storage fees for a week. Cost us $800 to get it back. When I complained to the department, they said she was just doing her job." Mrs. Rodriguez was not the only one. Over the next few weeks, I heard similar stories from other neighbors. Karen had a pattern of finding minor violations and escalating them into major problems for anyone who crossed her. Expired tags became vehicle impoundments. Noise complaints became disorderly conduct charges. Property line disputes became harassment investigations. She was systematically terrorizing the neighborhood, and her badge made her untouchable. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in July. I was hosting a small barbecue for Sarah's birthday when Karen's pool began overflowing again. This time, the water flowed directly across our deck, soaking our guests and ruining the food. I marched over to her house and pounded on the door. When she answered, she was holding a glass of wine and laughing at something someone had said behind her. She had company over, which meant she had deliberately overfilled the pool knowing it would ruin our dinner. "Karen, you have to stop this," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "This is harassment." "Harassment," she repeated, raising her eyebrows. "That is a serious accusation, David. Are you saying I am intentionally targeting you?" "Yes, that is exactly what I am saying." Her guests had gathered behind her now, curious about the confrontation. I recognized two of them as other deputies from her department. "David, I think you need to be very careful about the accusations you make," Karen said, her voice carrying that familiar official tone. "Especially when you are making them in front of witnesses. False accusations of harassment can be criminal charges themselves." One of the deputies nodded in agreement. "Sheriff Martinez is one of the most professional officers I have ever worked with. If she says something is an accident, then it is an accident." I looked at their faces and realized how hopeless my situation had become. Karen was not just protected by her badge. She was protected by an entire system of people who would support her word over mine, no matter what the evidence showed. "Just please," I said quietly, "just fix your drainage." Karen smiled that cold smile I had learned to hate. "I will look into it when I have time. You have a good evening, David." The door closed, and I walked back to my ruined party knowing that official channels would never help me. If I wanted justice, I was going to have to find another way. The catastrophic flood that changed everything happened on a Saturday morning in August. Sarah and I had been working in the garden since dawn, trying to save what little remained of our landscaping after 2 months of Karen's water warfare. We were replanting the memorial rose garden I had created for my father, who had passed away the year before. Those roses were special. Dad had been a gardener too, and before he died, he had given me cuttings from his prize-winning hybrid tea roses. They were the last living connection I had to him, and I had spent months carefully nurturing them back to health after Karen's previous floods. I was on my hands and knees, gently placing the largest bush back into fresh soil, when I heard the familiar sound of rushing water. But this time it was different. This time it sounded like Niagara Falls. I looked up to see a wall of water cascading over Karen's pool deck. It was not just overflow this time. Someone had opened the drain valve completely, and thousands of gallons were pouring out in a torrent that swept across my yard like a tsunami. "Sarah, get inside," I yelled, but it was too late. The water hit my memorial garden with devastating force, uprooting the roses I had just planted and washing away the special soil I had prepared. My father's roses tumbled past me in the flood, their roots exposed and broken. I ran toward Karen's house, wading through knee-deep water, desperate to stop the destruction. But when I reached her back door, I could see through the window that she was sitting at her kitchen table, calmly eating breakfast and watching the disaster unfold with obvious amusement. When she saw me at her door, she smiled and waved like she was greeting an old friend. I pounded on the glass. "Karen, turn off the water. You are destroying everything." She stood up slowly, walked to the door, and opened it just wide enough to speak through the gap. "Oh my," she said with fake concern. "It looks like my pool drain malfunctioned. What a terrible accident." "This is not an accident," I shouted. "You did this on purpose." "David, you are clearly upset and not thinking clearly. I would hate for you to say something you will regret later, especially something that might be considered threatening a law enforcement officer." Behind her, I could see one of her deputy friends from the night before, sitting at the table with his phone out, clearly recording our conversation. "You planned this," I said, my voice breaking with rage and grief. "You waited until you saw me replanting my father's roses, and then you destroyed them on purpose." "I think you should go home and calm down," Karen said, "before you do something that gets you arrested." The water was still flowing, carrying away the last remnants of my memorial garden. I watched my father's roses disappear down the storm drain, and something inside me snapped. Not anger, something colder and more dangerous. Clarity. I looked at Karen's smug face and realized that she was right about one thing. Official channels were never going to help me. She had created a perfect system where she could terrorize anyone she wanted, and her badge made her immune to consequences. But every system has weaknesses. And as I stood there watching my father's roses disappear forever, I began to see hers. Karen's weakness was her pride, specifically her pride in her perfect home. I had been inside once, shortly after she moved in, and I remembered being struck by how immaculate everything was. White furniture, spotless carpets, expensive electronics arranged with museum-like precision. She had bragged about the professional interior design, the imported tile, the custom millwork. Her house was her sanctuary, her trophy, her proof that she was better than everyone else on the street. "You are right," I said quietly, my voice perfectly calm now. "I should go home." Karen looked surprised by my sudden change in tone. "Good. I am glad you are being reasonable." I walked back through the floodwater to my house, stepping over the broken stems of my father's roses. Sarah met me at the door, her face full of concern. "David, what are you going to do?" I looked back at Karen's pool, towering above our fence like a fortress. But fortresses could be sieged. And sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy was to use their own weapons against them. "I am going to fix our drainage problem," I said. That night I began planning. Not revenge, justice. There is a difference, and that difference was about to teach Sheriff Karen the hardest lesson of her life. For the next 3 weeks, I became a student of water flow and property engineering. During the day, I went through the motions of my normal routine, but every free moment was spent researching drainage systems, water pressure calculations, and the physics of liquid dynamics. I started taking long walks around the neighborhood, studying the storm drain system, and mapping how water moved through our area during heavy rains. I discovered that our street sat on a slight slope, with Karen's house positioned at the high end and most of the other homes below her. The storm drains were old and inadequate for heavy flows, which explained why Karen's floods had been so devastating to my property. But those same drains could work in reverse if properly redirected. I also began documenting Karen's schedule with military precision. She worked 4 days on, 2 days off, and her shifts ran from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning. On her days off, she usually went out with her deputy friends until late, leaving her house empty for hours at a time. Most importantly, I started studying her pool system itself. The massive above-ground structure was held together with basic hardware store components. The drainage system was simple but effective, designed to move large volumes of water quickly when necessary. During my evening walks, I would casually observe her property, noting the location of her pool equipment, the routing of her drainage pipes, and the layout of her perfectly manicured lawn. Karen had positioned everything to direct water away from her house and toward mine, but basic engineering principles meant that flow could be reversed with the right modifications. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Karen's house sat slightly lower than her pool deck. She had built up the pool area with a retaining wall and imported fill dirt, creating an elevated platform that gave her a commanding view of the neighborhood. But that elevation difference meant gravity was working in my favor. I also recruited help, though my allies did not know they were helping. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that her nephew worked for a plumbing supply company and might be able to get materials at a discount. When I told her I was working on improving my yard drainage after all the flood damage, she was eager to help. "That woman has terrorized this neighborhood long enough," she said. "If there is anything I can do to help you protect your property, just ask." Other neighbors felt the same way. Mr. Chen from 2 houses down lent me his truck for a weekend hardware run. The Johnsons offered to let me use their garage as a staging area for supplies. Nobody asked too many questions about exactly what I was planning, but everyone understood that Karen needed to be stopped. The moral struggle was real. Sarah noticed that I was distracted and stressed, spending long hours on my computer and making mysterious trips to hardware stores. When she asked what I was working on, I told her I was researching legal options for dealing with Karen. It was not entirely a lie. I was researching options, just not legal ones. "David, I am worried about you," she said one evening. "You are not sleeping, you are barely eating, and you seem obsessed with that woman. Maybe we should just move, find a new house somewhere else." "Run away," I asked. "Let her win." Sometimes walking away is the smartest choice, especially when you are dealing with someone who has that kind of power. I understood her concern, but moving would not solve the problem. Karen would still be here, terrorizing other neighbors, using her badge to make life miserable for anyone who crossed her. And somewhere else, there would be another Sheriff Karen doing the same thing to other innocent people. "What if nobody ever stands up to bullies like her?" I asked. "What if everyone just runs away and lets them win?" Sarah did not have an answer for that. By the end of August, I had everything I needed. The materials were staged. The timeline was planned. The weather forecast showed a clear night with no moon. Karen would be working a night shift, leaving her house empty and unguarded. The only thing left was to make a final decision about crossing a line I could never uncross. Once I started down this path, there would be no going back. I would either succeed in teaching Karen a lesson she would never forget, or I would end up in jail, destroyed by the same system that protected her. But every time I looked at the empty space where my father's roses used to grow, the choice became clear. Justice was worth the risk. The operation began at midnight on a Tuesday in September. Karen had left for her night shift an hour earlier, and the neighborhood was dark and quiet. I had been watching her house from my bedroom window, waiting for the perfect moment to move. I started by gathering my supplies from the garage: PVC pipe fittings, flexible drainage hose, a small pump, and the tools I would need to make the connections. Everything fit into a canvas bag that I could carry quietly across the yard. The most challenging part was accessing Karen's pool equipment without being seen. Her backyard was well lit by security lights, but I had studied the shadows and blind spots during my evening walks. There was a narrow corridor along the fence line where the lighting did not reach, just wide enough for someone to work undetected. Getting over the fence was easier than I had expected. Karen's retaining wall created a natural step that brought me within easy reach of the top rail. I dropped quietly into her yard and made my way to the pool equipment. The pool drain system was exactly as I had observed during my reconnaissance. A simple valve controlled the flow from the main drain, connected to a flexible hose that ran underground to the storm drain system. All I needed to do was redirect that hose. The first challenge was disconnecting the existing drainage without triggering any alarms. Karen's pool had a sophisticated filtration system, but the drain was manual and gravity-fed. I slowly opened the valve and watched as water began to flow through the hose. Working by flashlight, I carefully disconnected the drainage hose from its current route and attached my own extension system. The new routing would carry Karen's pool water around the side of her house, up through a temporary pump system I had positioned near her front door, and directly through her mail slot into her living room. The engineering was actually simple once I understood the basics. Water always flows downhill, but with the right pump system, you can make it flow uphill too. Karen's pool held thousands of gallons, positioned 10 feet above her house foundation. Once I opened the drain valve completely, gravity and pressure would do most of the work. The trickiest part was concealing the temporary pump and hose system. I had to route everything through her landscaping in a way that would not be visible from the street, while still maintaining enough water pressure to flood her interior. By 2 in the morning, everything was connected and tested. I had run a small test flow to make sure the system worked, sending a few gallons through the line to confirm that water was reaching her living room. Through her front window, I could see a small puddle forming on her white carpet. The moment of truth came when I fully opened Karen's pool drain valve. The sound was like opening a fire hydrant. Thousands of gallons began rushing through my improvised system with tremendous force. The pump kicked in automatically, pushing the water up and through her mail slot in a steady, powerful stream. I positioned myself across the street where I could observe the results while maintaining plausible deniability. If anyone saw me, I was just a neighbor out for a late-night walk who happened to notice something unusual at Karen's house. The first sign of success came within minutes. Water began pouring out from under Karen's front door, spreading across her porch and down her front steps. Through the windows, I could see the disaster unfolding inside. Her white furniture was floating. Her expensive electronics were submerged. Her perfect carpet was ruined. But the most satisfying moment came 20 minutes later, when Karen's patrol car came racing down the street with lights flashing. She had received some kind of alert system notification and was rushing home to discover the disaster. I watched from the shadows as she jumped out of her car and waded through the flood pouring from her own front door. Her screams of rage and disbelief echoed through the quiet neighborhood. She was experiencing the same helpless fury I had felt watching my father's roses wash away. The irony was perfect. Karen was being destroyed by her own weapon, flooded by water from her own pool, using the same drainage system she had used to terrorize me for months. By the time she managed to turn off her pool drain, it was too late. Her living room was completely flooded. Her furniture was floating. Her electronics were destroyed. Everything she had used to demonstrate her superiority was now waterlogged garbage. I slipped back to my house before she could organize a search of the neighborhood. But through my bedroom window, I watched as she stood in her ruined living room, finally understanding what it felt like to be the victim instead of the perpetrator. Justice had been served, and it was even sweeter than I had imagined. Karen's attempts at retaliation began within hours of discovering her flooded house. By sunrise, she was pounding on my door, demanding to search my property for evidence of sabotage. When I politely refused without a warrant, she threatened to get one. "I know you did this," she snarled, still wearing her wet uniform from wadding through her own living room. "Nobody else on this street has the motivation or the knowledge to pull off something like this." "Karen, I have no idea what you are talking about," I replied calmly. "I was asleep all night. Sarah can confirm that." "Your wife will say whatever you tell her to say, but I will find proof. And when I do, you are going to prison for destruction of property, breaking and entering, and harassment of a law enforcement officer." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She was so accustomed to intimidating people that she could not conceive of someone who was no longer afraid of her threats. "I am sorry about your house," I said. "Flooding is terrible. I know from experience how devastating it can be when water destroys everything you care about." The look in her eyes told me she understood the reference perfectly. Over the next few days, Karen threw everything she had at trying to prove I was responsible for her flood. She brought crime scene investigators to process her property. She interviewed every neighbor on the street. She even tried to get a warrant to search my house, claiming she had evidence of my involvement. But every investigation led nowhere. I had been careful to leave no physical evidence. The temporary pump and hose system had been removed within hours of the flood. The connection points where I had modified her drainage showed no signs of tampering that could not be explained by normal wear and maintenance. More importantly, Karen's own behavior had created a neighborhood full of hostile witnesses. When investigators interviewed my neighbors about my character and whereabouts, they got an earful about Karen's pattern of harassment and abuse of power. Mrs. Rodriguez told them about her son's excessive arrest. Mr. Chen described how Karen had threatened him over a property line dispute. The Johnsons explained how she had used her position to intimidate anyone who questioned her authority. The picture that emerged was not of an innocent victim, but of a corrupt officer who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. When investigators asked about possible motives for targeting Karen, they got a long list of people who had reasons to want revenge. The breakthrough in my favor came when Karen's insurance company began investigating the claim. Professional adjusters quickly determined that the flood had been caused by a malfunction in her own pool drainage system. They found evidence that the drain valve had been opened fully, causing a catastrophic release of water that overwhelmed her home's foundation drainage. "Looks like human error," the adjuster told Karen. "Someone opened this valve all the way and forgot to close it, probably during routine maintenance. The damage is consistent with several hours of full drainage flow." Karen protested that she never would have made such a mistake, but the insurance company was not interested in her theories about sabotage. They paid the claim and closed the case, officially ruling the flood an accident caused by operator error. The final blow to Karen's retaliation efforts came when her own department began investigating the pattern of complaints against her. All of my neighbors' stories about her harassment and abuse of power had been documented during the flood investigation, creating an official record of misconduct. Within a month, Karen was facing an internal affairs investigation for abuse of authority, harassment of citizens, and failure to maintain professional standards. The very system that had protected her became the instrument of her downfall. By October, Karen had quietly transferred to a different district, far from our neighborhood. Her house went up for sale, and new owners moved in before Christmas. They were a young couple with a baby who immediately drained the pool and converted the space into a playground. The best part was watching my yard recover. Without Karen's constant flooding, the grass grew back thick and green. I replanted my father's memorial garden with new roses, protected now by proper drainage that would never again be threatened by an abusive neighbor. Sometimes justice comes through official channels, and sometimes it requires more creative solutions. But it always comes, eventually, to those patient enough to wait for the right moment and brave enough to act when that moment arrives. Karen learned that authority without accountability is just another form of weakness. And I learned that sometimes the most effective way to stop a bully is to give them a taste of their own medicine. The neighborhood has been peaceful ever since.